Welcome to Breaking Doctrine, presented to you by the Combined Arms Doctrine Directorate at the Combined Arms Center at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. The views expressed here are those of the individual and do not represent the views of the Combined Arms Center, U.S. Army, or U.S. government.
Welcome to Breaking Doctrine, a U.S. Army Combined Arms Center podcast series that dials in on some of the basic tenets, principles, and overall ideas in Army doctrine. On 26 December 1776, General George Washington crossed the Delaware, beginning the U.S. Army history of conducting gap crossings to support maneuver operations. More than 246 years later, and the focus on gap crossing remains a high priority for maneuver in the Army. Hello, I'm Major James Cole, and on behalf of the Combined Arms Doctrine Directorate, welcome to Breaking Doctrine. Today's podcast will discuss gap crossing operations, Army Techniques Publication ATP 3-90.4, and Marine Corps Warfighting Publication MCWP 3-17.8, Combined Arms Mobility, focus on gap crossing operations. Our guests today represent subject matter experts on gap crossing operations. They come to us from units and organizations that give them a unique perspective to be able to discuss the challenges the Army faces with gap crossing. I would like to welcome Colonel Joseph Clete Goetz, the 100th Commandant of the U.S. Army Engineer School, Lieutenant Colonel Terry Riesel, Engineer and Protection Warfighting Function Chief for Ops Group Charlie at the Mission Command Training Program, MCTP, and Mr. Jeff LaFace, Tactics Author and Lead Author for ATP 3-91 Division Operations. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. I'll go to you for opening comments. The forces transitioned to train for the conduct of large-scale combat operations against near-peer threats. As the Commandant of the Engineer School, which mobility task is the most important for young engineers to learn?
Yeah, hey, thanks for having me. I appreciate the comments about Washington crossing to Delaware. You know, Washington was a surveyor. We'll claim it as an engineer in this case, in the first successful, execution of a wet gap crossing for the U.S. Army. You'd think about mobility tasks that we want young engineers in particular to be good at as we transition to LSCO. Two come to mind. The combined arms breach and the wet gap crossing. And I say the wet gap crossing because it's very complex, requires very detailed coordination, across the warfighting functions. It requires flexibility as the enemy gets a vote and your plan is subject or likely to change. It requires technical expertise, not only of engineering, but again, across those warfighting functions and the capabilities that they can bring to bear and that you want to leverage in order for the gap crossing to be successful. And so as we train young engineers on those tasks, this is one where I feel if you can get a wet gap crossing right, you can get almost anything right, because you've shown that you've got the mettle to do one of the hardest things that we're going to ask the Army to do.
Shifting to today's topic of gap crossing, we have to highlight that ATP 3-90.4 Combined Arms Mobility has recently been revised by the doctrine writers at Maneuver Support Center of Excellence. With that said, the principles and fundamentals within the document remain unchanged, particularly Chapter 4 of the publication, Gap Crossing, which enables maneuver, and Chapter 5, Gap Crossing in Support of Maneuver, which enables movement. Mr. LaFace, as the lead author for ATP 3-91 Division Operations and as a retired armor officer, what do you think when you hear gap crossing?
Well, from my perspective, gap crossing is not new to the Army. It's something that we've done continuously throughout our history. And from a division perspective, it's the smallest formation that can command and control a gap crossing with our brigade combat teams executing it. But a gap crossing is just an enabling operation, but to caveat what you said, sir, it is probably, in my opinion, the most complicated operation that a Army force can do in combat, whether it's hasty, deliberate, or covert. It is a operation that allows a corps with that division to continue its operations to move on to the Corps' final objectives. But as an enabling operation, it has many sub-components of other enabling operations, passage of line, troop movements, and then all of the synchronization and coordination in time and space that the division staff, with help from the Corps staff and the brigade combat team executing, it is the hardest thing that we do. And it's good to see that the emphasis is back on this very complicated issue in operation.
Thank you, sir. And I agree with you. It is one of the hardest things that we have to do. Doctrine provides the base for our shared experience and common language to conduct operations. How has the engineer schoolhouse adjusted the development of the force to prepare to conduct a gap crossing in a large-scale combat operation environment?
I think we've been fortunate that the doctrine hasn't changed much in the last several years, but there are some things, emerging, particularly with the publication of the new 3.0, operations that we're going to have to account for, right? This notion of a transparent battlefield, and we default to discussing, what we've seen in Ukraine and the Russian experience in Ukraine. I think one of the things we're going to have to adjust to when we update doctrine is, how do we account for the fact that you're always going to be observed, right? And then this concept of disaggregation, and then the ability to aggregate quickly. And in this case, on a very, very small point, on the battlefield. How do we train that, and how do we do that? So the dispersion aspect, and it's something we always go back to, and I think, regardless of our operational concept, is just going to be control, and how we control, the flow of forces, across this bridge or across this choke point. So I think, the nature of what it is that we have to do here is not going to change. You got to get forces across the gap. Once you start putting forces across the gap, you've rung the dinner bell for the enemy. They know exactly where it is that you're coming, and so it is a race to get combat power across the far side of that wet gap as quickly as you can. So that's not going to change. I think some of the character is going to have to change. How do we see the deception operation? How do we try to convince the enemy we're going to go somewhere else? How do we operate disaggregated and then aggregate quickly and cross and really maintain tempo, for the crossing force at a period of pretty significant vulnerability for them?
Well, I know there was a time when the Army as a whole started moving the multi-role bridge companies up to the echelons above brigade level. And we took bridging out of the curriculum for the engineer schoolhouse. And then we brought it back as we started to ramp up the large-scale combat operation discussion and the change from the coin environment. Is that still a main priority for the engineer schoolhouse at this point, sir? Yeah,
it is. We spend a lot of time talking about bridging. In those, not only things like the improved ribbon bridge, right? The float bridge that people see. We're beginning to spend some time talking about fixed bridging, line of communication bridging. That would go in after the float bridge is a little bit more permanent, oriented on sustainment and things like that. Those MRBCs now are still at echelon above brigade. As the Army contemplates, what it is they want their divisions to do. As a unit of action, there are plans afoot to get them inside of our heavy divisions, so that those divisions have the means at their disposal, to train the full range of their METs, right? Because one of the things that gap crossing involves, usually in Phase 5, continue the attack, is that there's a passage of lines, and so another element is going to go through the crossing force. And in some of the environments we can see ourselves fighting, not too far down the road, they're going to have to do this gap crossing again. And so, regardless of how we array the force in existing bridge companies, every force, mechanized or otherwise, is going to have to contend with rivers, and we're looking at ways to give them the means to be able to train that.
If you ever stop and look at some of the pictures hanging in the halls here on Leavenworth, you will see Command and General Staff College students up to World War II were required to execute a wet gap crossing. This underscores the importance of the wet gap crossing. Do you think it should be brought back to the curriculum of the Command and General Staff College?
Yeah, I think so. If for nothing else, than as a vehicle, for learning. You go back to my opening comments, where this is very complex. It's detailed coordination across warfighting functions. It requires technical expertise and synchronization. As you teach students here for operations at the division level, I think it probably is the most complex thing that they can plan. It draws in everybody across that staff group, right? Your maneuver officers, your sustainment officers, your signaleers, intel for sure, fires, right? Everybody's got a piece to play in this thing, and I think it's a great vehicle for teaching. And they're going to get out and they're going to join divisions and brigades. They're going to go through warfighters, and they're going to see this on every single warfighter. And I tell you, I don't know about you, but I find great comfort in having some context to lean on, what past experience, be it PME or experiential, so that I can say, I've at least seen this before, and I kind of have some idea what to expect. I think it's a great idea to teach here. One of the things I get to do, and it's a great privilege to be able to do it, is come here for ASEP-C, which is a course designed for our 2-star generals going into command. And we go through a series of vignettes, everything from forward passage of line, shaping, et cetera. But one of the things we spend a couple hours talking are wet gap crossing. So I think there's an acknowledgement, within the force that we've got to get ourselves out of the habit of saying, we've got a right to be bad at this because no one's ever done it. That's just not going to cut it. And we owe our soldiers better. So, if I were a major, I would definitely want to be conversant on something my division commander was conversant on, because that might be a moment of terror when I'm briefing a 2-star and I realize that they've got information dominance on me for something that I'm not prepared to talk.
Absolutely. Yeah, one of the leaders that I knew in the past would say, see everything in training first so you don't see it the first time in combat. And I think that's the same way we need to be with, gap crossing operations, where it's not the first time in combat that we're seeing it.
Yeah, I mean you're right. And look, some of the first times the Army has done this in combat, frankly, didn't go so well. Fredericksburg did not go particularly well. 1944, crossing the Moselle, did not go particularly well, where we decided to do a hasty versus the deliberate, river crossing. There's a butcher's bill associated with failure here, and we got to get after it in training, and sets and reps are very meaningful. If you get a bridge company to the gap and tell them to cross it, they will absolutely cross it. One of the things that we realized over the course of 20 years of COIN, it wasn't just the U.S., it was our allies as well, is that we accumulated risk in bridging for all the right reasons. Our focus was on other areas, and we're addressing that now. We've got some new unit builds that are going to get after this, and so what we're going to see is an increased capacity for us to be able to cross wet gaps. And again, you're going to see it with bridging companies, resident in our heavy formations across the Army. So we're getting it right. We're getting it right. It's going to take time, and it moves at the speed of industry and the ability of the generating force to make 12 Charlies. And then there's the leader development piece as well for our mid-grade NCOs. So we will get this right.
I know that several years ago they talked about, and a great deal about, in breaching operations and in gap crossing operations, going unmanned. Is that still something that we're pursuing with regard to equipment and planning, sir?
Yeah, a lot of what we're doing are trying to get the sapper out of the breach, and in this case, it's get the bridge crew member, out of the gap crossing. One of the, I think, most interesting days I've been able to spend in this job was with the really, really smart folks down at the Engineer Research and Development Center down in Vicksburg, who are thinking about and are solving problems that we don't even know that we have yet. And so autonomy and engineering in bridging is on our radar, and they're looking at it. Small rafts for individual vehicles is on their radar, and they're looking at it. So there's a whole host of technologies that they're thinking about that are going to reduce some of the risk, either at the mission level or the soldier level, for the future bridging. This stuff is years away, and that's okay. We'll refine this stuff, but I think the way we bridge in 2040 is and ought to be very different than the way we bridge in 2023, and I think it will be.
I'm sure a lot of lessons learned from the Ukraine are coming in handy in the Arctic right now, sir.
Well, yeah, they are. I mean, Russian river crossing doctrine and American river crossing doctrine is very, very similar. I don't know if they didn't read their doctrine, or I don't know if it's a function of decision making. But there's a lot to be learned by the way that they go about crossing those rivers. And these aren't big wet gaps. No. I mean they're not. And in some cases, we're talking. The U.S. Army is contemplating several times the size crossings that the Russians have attempted here. This is very, very complex.
Roger that, sir. So let's talk execution at the headquarters of the focus on LSCO with observations of division and corps. Colonel Riesel, sir, your team observes a minimum of 5 exercises with between 2 and 4 division and corps headquarters in each exercise for the planning and execution of warfighters. How are commanders and staffs adjusting under LSCO and preparing for a gap crossing?
Thank you for the question. So I've spoken with my team to get a consensus on how to properly answer this question, and we all agree that the most important step that for adjusting is having a deliberate plan for the wet gap crossing specifically, not just a phase during the operation for the wet gap, but having a plan with fighting documents, with a specific execution check, a conditions check, doing a specific wet gap crossing rehearsal, so that the brigades, not just the BCTs, but the aviation brigade, the fires brigade, the sustainment brigade, the maneuver enhancement brigade, so all the brigades understand the roles and responsibilities during that wet gap crossing. Having branches and sequels, what happens if we're successful early, what happens if we culminate early, and so that there's a thorough plan and it's rehearsed to understand the concept of the operations in time, space. Additionally, I would say during that planning process, clearly defining the roles and responsibilities for the command nodes. What is the responsibility for that division TAC? More than just own the close fight. Is that where they want to have the crossing area commander? Will that be co-located with the crossing area engineer? Having clear roles and responsibilities for, say, the D main. What is the RCP doing? Rear command post, and how do all of the brigade command nodes with fires in the cab? How are they tied into the deep attack and how is the maneuver enhancement brigade managing that terrain? A wet gap crossing on a map is a phenomenal feat. It's huge. It requires a lot of control points, a lot of checkpoints, and empowering that maneuver enhancement brigade to have the responsibility to execute those, so that the multi-row bridge company isn't on the flot until it needs to be. It's a large lumbering element that is easily taken out by the enemy artillery. So having that synchronized in time and space is really important. Additionally, I mentioned fighting products, making sure that the staff at echelon understands, say the conditions checks and the execution check, where, how do we set the conditions? Are we utilizing the multi-domain when we're doing obscuration, or are we just planning linear smoke targets? The more successful divisions think about it in the multi-domain more than just smoke. understanding where the sequence of time is, how we use the the deception plan. How are we utilizing the deception plan? Where is it located? How does that get executed? Do we have the logistics to execute that? And we've definitely seen those successful at the division and the corps level. For the corps, they have capabilities that the divisions don't have, and how are they weighting the main effort is key, especially if the corps has the reserve for the MRBCs. So, I would say divisions have definitely transitioned to LISCO, where they're not just, allocating a BCT to execute the wet gap crossing. The planners at the division level are seeing it as their mission, as the division mission, and moving forward with synchronizing the brigades across the entire division area, having a redundancy plan, deception, and then follow on forces once they cross the gap. If they culminate, how do they establish a hasty defense? Having that planned before you culminate is pretty key.
Terry, something I look at, like coach engineers to do this is, we're getting ready to execute the wet gap crossing. Go and look at that maneuver commander's decision support template. And if you look at that decision support template and those critical decisions that affect the wet gap crossing aren't on there, then you're all alone, man. Like, right? That someone is viewing the gap crossing as an engineer show, right? When it is a combined arms, operation. And so, and when you get it on the DST, then you've got some real power there. The G3 is tracking it, the G2 is tracking it, right? Because you've got now, you move beyond condition setting to where you've tied it to a PIR, priority intelligence requirement, and a friendly forces information requirement. And you've got the entire staff looking at it. And that's when you can begin to feel maybe a little bit comfortable that you're combining arms, so to speak, and the whole staff is looking at this as a division problem and not a engineer get us across the river problem.
And that seems to be the issue that you see, is that people without the experience and the training and the education view a wet gap crossing as an engineer problem, so the maneuver guys can get to the other side and then continue on and plant a flag on the big core objective on the far side. And it's not. It's a corps commander problem. It's a division commander problem that's executed by brigade combat team commanders, and they're the ones that are responsible with their staff and the help from the engineer brigade or other engineers that are on the division staff to sequence it and call things forward under the command and control of the division TAC to get them across, whether it's 2 crossing sites or or more, depending on what assets are available. And that's because when we're writing ATP 391 for division operations, we have a separate appendix specifically for the wet gap crossing, because people just, not through any fault of their own, but just for inexperience, don't understand all the moving pieces and parts that are involved and how do you see to this thing. And the decisive part is not actually the crossing itself, it's being able to get enough combat power across to secure it and then pass somebody through, because that's what's most important to the corps commander.
Yeah, great point, right? We spent a lot of time talking about phase 2, assault across the gap. I truly believe that this fight is won or lost, phase 1, or phase 0. Some of the shaping. You get the bridge company there and they survive. You got them in the right place in the order of march. They're gonna cross that thing. But yeah, you're absolutely right.
And then when a division has that success at the wet gap, as you had mentioned, sir, getting the lock Bs forward, because you're going to need all of those float bays at the next fight, at the next crossing site. And I feel that divisions are having that plan, integrating with the logistics planner or in the G4 to get that piece of equipment moving forward and getting that lock B in place.
Yeah, so we would begin to template moving lock B before the lead division even conducted passage of lines. I mean, that's how far in advance you've got to be thinking of it. But when you think about Lock B, one of the things I don't want leaders to do is fixate on where we put in the assault float bridge, right? Where you put in the assault float bridge may not be the place that you want to put in your Lock B, right? You're going to put that assault float bridge in, the place that supports maneuver, facilitates deception, maximizes the probability that you're going to be able to get combat forces across that wet gap. But that might not be a great place that you want to sustain across, right? So the first thing I would coach people is, hey, look for fixed bridging. All right, so if you can take that piece of fixed infrastructure, and even if you got to reinforce it, I'm telling you, it's going to be make your life easier than if you have to put in a Lock B. And if you've got to put in a Lock B, then I refer to that kind of as the bridge of last resort, because that is something that I think transcends being a tactical operation to really becoming a construction project because of some of the tolerances involved and some of the equipments that involved. I mean, imagine, if you will, a crane going boom up on the flot. Probably not a super survivable situation there, but that is really what we're talking about doing when we talk about putting in Lock B.
Excellent discussion, gentlemen. I want to kind of rewind just a little bit, because we talk about the ATP and we give everyone the references, but we really haven't given them the additional information they may need to connect some of the dots when it comes to what we're talking about with regard to gap crossing. So we identified 3 different types of crossings: deliberate, hasty, and covert. Can you gentlemen talk about those 3 types of crossings and when or why we would do, say, a hasty crossing versus a deliberate?
Well, I mean, the preferred method is to be able to do it covertly, because it has a minimal effect on disrupting the division's ability to overcome the obstacle and move on to a core objective without it losing so much combat power that you actually have to do a passage of line for that force. Hasty is something that a division looks for, but it takes advantage of the terrain and some of the things that are there at the gap, such as a ford or being able to put a bridge in quickly without having to pause for more than 6 to 8 hours, as I understand it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of those situations where the division commander sees the benefits of maintaining tempo, outweigh the risks of not, executing a deliberate crossing, in the full and detailed coordination. I think it's a risk calculus.
Historically, from what I understand, usually there's great risk to the force, because if you you push forward to do a hasty crossing and your read of the enemy or the situation is not as advantageous as you thought, historically, that's when units have gotten themselves into a lot of trouble, and a lot of American soldiers have gotten killed, captured, and then they have to pull back, regroup, and then go into a more deliberate planning process in order to get across the gap, because the enemy always gets a vote.
Yep. And at that point, you've lost the element of surprise, you've lost combat power, and you've blunted your tempo as well.
And I've seen a division do more than just one during a warfighter exercise. So the div cav forward, may execute a covert to get on the other side of the wet gap to do that reconnaissance mission to understand what the enemy is, and then go in, while the division's also planning a deliberate, and like somebody mentioned earlier, the enemy gets a vote. So if that deliberate execution site, where they're going to plan on doing, and have most of the float bays in and indirect fires come in, then we have to do a hasty in a different location, just because we still have to cross the river. We've got some of our forces across from rafting, and so it's not uncommon from my foxhole to see more than one of those types of wet gap crossings occur.
And that really gets to the fundamentals of the gap crossing that are listed in 3-90.4, the first being surprise, which you've mentioned several times, sir. Of the rest, I think speed is probably one of the most important, and we've talked about that as well. Is there any part of preparation or flexible planning and traffic management that you would want the force to focus on in planning ahead of time?
Traffic management. Super not glamorous, right? I think no one wants to get into traffic management business. But 1,200-ish vehicles in an ABCT, I don't know, quick math. So you put 30 meters in between them, you know, what's that, like 36 kilometers? You know, that's a heck of a traffic jam, you know, by anyone's standard. So I think you put the work in for traffic management. I think you also put the work in for terrain management, because everywhere that's a great place for a bridge park is a great place for position area artillery, is a great place for tactical assembly area, is a great place for CPs, a great place for FARP. So you're going to have competition for the prime real estate in the division's AO. So, you know, the things that'll make you successful when you get that bridge in to sustain your tempo are the things that are, you know, probably really just onerous and nitty gritty and not glamorous, you know, kind of thing that no one really wants to do. That I think will be the difference between success and failure. So it's terrain and traffic, and you got great MPs out there, you know, whose job it is to regulate the traffic flow, you know, from the assembly areas to the holding areas onto the engineer regulating points and across the bridges, and then working things out on the far side of the gap as well.
I think it's important to remind everyone that it's two-way traffic as well. So
eventually you get to two-way traffic. You're right. You know, so when you put a brigade, when you put a BCT across a gap, you're going to have two center lines, and then you're going to have another bridge company doing rafting operations. And, you know, in the early hours of that thing, I mean, it's going to be, you know, straight one-way traffic across there, because again, like it's a race to get combat power, you know, to the bridgehead lines, and then eventually casualties got to come back. Damaged equipment has to come back. You've got to sustain across that thing. And eventually it does become two-way traffic. I think that decision is one of the critical decisions a division commander or a DCG in the DTAC has got to make.
And for the crossing itself, we talked a lot about bridges and that kind of stuff, but the role of rafting, because that's the first thing that you're going to do after you get your assault force across the river and they're securing that toehold. You're going to start rafting, because that's where you're going to be able to get your tanks and your infantry fighting vehicles and your other heavy equipment across initially, so that they can expand, so that when you finally make the decision to put the bridge in, there's no direct fire that they have to worry about. There's a minimal amount of indirect fire, and the division can, through rafting and then when that one bridge is there, just get more combat power, because that's the thing that's going to cause the most issues on the far side.
Yeah, I think, you know, rafting gives you your flexibility. I think it also offers you a degree of protection as well, because that raft is moving. You can have different rafting points, even, you know, within the crossing area. And the thing that gives you the throughput is that full closure.
Sir, the Army recently published its new version of FM 3-0, which discusses multi-domain operations. Where do you see us going, and how will it affect engineer doctrine in the future?
So there are 5 tenets of multi-domain operations. When I think about bridging, really I think about 3 of them. I think about endurance, I think about depth, and I think about convergence. You know, all 3 come into play in this particular operation. For the engineer regiment, you know, things that I'm thinking about. You know, the regiment has always been in the business of overcoming and enhancing the impacts of terrain to put us in a position of advantage. You know, with MDO, you know, 5 domains, 3 dimensions, transparency, all these things that we see coming down the pike in the operating environment, and we're seeing to a limited extent in Europe and things we anticipate seeing in other parts of the world. I begin to wonder if we need to get into business of not only overcoming and enhancing the impacts of terrain, but if we have to get into the business of mitigating the effects of distance as well, right? So mobility, very much into mobility, but not perhaps in a tactical sense, but even in the operational sense, to allow the Army to capitalize on the tenets of MDO, I think is going to take a regiment that focuses on the impacts of distance on the force as well. Because you got longer range shooters, you got longer range ISR, you've just got a deeper battle space. But agility is also a tenet of MDO. So you're going to have elements that potentially are dispersed or further to the rear than you would otherwise like them to be, but for the purposes of protection, have to be there in order to survive. And then someone has to give them the ability to get to where they need to be or change where they are quickly in order to be able to do that. I think that is incumbent on the regiment, and that's something that I'm beginning to think about, and I think it's going to make its way into our doctrine. It's not only about terrain now, it's going to be about distance.
Sir, I would say that's your comments are very accurate into how divisions are utilizing the tenets during warfighters. Windows of convergence for protection, for obscuration during the wet gap crossing is exactly the direction divisions are headed in.
Think about it though, especially about endurance, right? So these bridges aren't going to be in the water for hours. They're going to be in the water for days, weeks, and potentially months. So how are we thinking about? We talk about creating temporal windows of superiority in multiple domains, in order to converge effects and defeat the enemy. In this case, though, this thing that is very important to us and really is an essential lifeline to maintaining the tempo of our operations is something that we're going to have to maintain superiority in multiple domains, not temporally in a short sense, but for a heck of a long time. It's going to put demands, particularly on the protection warfighting function, and how we think about protection and what we're willing to commit. Because as the divisions move forward, right, this thing that was once super important remains super important, but because it's 40, 50, 60 Ks to the rear, begins to become someone else's problem. But it's going to put tremendous demands on protection, to keep these things alive and in the water.
And then to go caveat what you're saying also, sir, is that because it becomes less important, it still has to have air defense to protect it from, all those different types of assets, indirect fire. So you still have to be able to protect it with radars and for counterfire. And just because it's way back there, if you want to drag a division to a grinding halt that's 60 kilometers that way, is take out that bridge that's not as important as it used to be, and now there's no way for fuel or ammo or whatever to get up to the warfighter that are up there doing their second or third river cross or wet gap crossing, and nobody was really paying attention because it's way back there in the rear with the gear. And it was somebody else's problem. It's something that you can't ignore, and because it's a valuable, limited resource, how long you can't afford not to ignore it. You can't afford to ignore it.
There's a security bill associated with this, and who pays that bill for security? I suspect, again, as divisions move forward, their rear boundary is gonna collapse, right? So the Corps is gonna own that space. It's probably gonna be the Corps' responsibility to maintain that. What does the Corps retain in order to secure and to protect that?
Right. And then there's just the general maintenance that goes along with it.
Yep.
That is no longer a priority because everybody's way out there up front. But again, it's now a lock and you have to maintain it.
Yeah, you do. And there are just some really just practical things that you've got to do when you've got a bridge in the water. You've got to break that thing every week or two just to let all the stuff, think the trash, tree limbs, tires, whatever, that float down the river. You got to break the bridge. You got to let all that stuff go by. Water levels are never constant. So water level goes down, you got to take bays out. Water level goes up, you got to add bays in. And so they are not just things you put in the water and forget. Some good bridge crewman, some bridge platoon is going to have to go out there and maintain that thing and inspect that thing to make sure that it's safe.
And maintenance on the boats, or if the current's high and they've got to keep the boats in the water. It's an endurance fight for sure.
Yeah, right. And so in a lot of cases, you can't just put the bridge in the water and let the boats go. I mean, in high flow conditions, you got to have boats on the downstream side pushing upstream, so you don't get a bow in that thing. So these bridges aren't a highway bridge. Right, they're marvels of engineering that you can back a truck up to the water, dump a bay in, connect those things up, and then pass an M1 over it is really pretty incredible.
Yes, sir.
Is that why there's such an emphasis on the, what do you call it, the B lock?
Lock B.
Lock B.
Where you take something that is temporary because it's needed forward, and then you have something that's more permanent but still needs to be protected, still needs to be maintained, still needs to be,
Yeah, so I mean the Lock B is a great system, and it's been around commercially, for a long time. And so you put in a float Lock B, the pontoons are the only things touching the water, so you don't really have you don't have a requirement to kind of clear the upstream detritus that lodges itself against the bridge. They're typically secured by cables on each shore to keep the bow out. The trade-off there is the time needed to in place. Like I said, putting in a Lock B is it's not so much a tactical operation as it is a construction project. And these things, some of the larger float Lock Bs, can take upwards of a week to a couple weeks to get them in. And so I think, we lull ourselves perhaps into a sense of complacency that, after a few hours we can just get a Lock B in, and that just takes a couple hours and our problems are solved. This is it's a great long-term solution. Just takes quite a while to get it in the water and ready to go. Which again, why I go back, look fixed bridging first. Think a Lock B as your bridge of last resort, or your bridge that gives you flexibility in your life. Should you lose that fixed bridging?
I hear endurance and agility, sir. For partners, how do we integrate them in the wet gap crossing?
Go ahead.
So great question, great point, because it's going to be very significant, especially as you approach the wet gap, right? So we're in somebody else's nation who's in conflict, so you're going to have a significant amount of IDPs, individually displaced personnel, going the opposite direction that we're trying to go. So utilizing, just from the beginning, utilizing host nation resources, whether it's security, police, whatever they have to help, for one, redirect those personnel, and then after the crossing site or after the gap crossing, utilizing contracts, right? Because some of those people that are displaced or that are still there, they're contractors, they're construction. They operate equipment. So there's still abilities to do operational contracting support (OCS) during the conflict to hire, and it stimulates the local economy again as well. So we can utilize those resources that nation has for fuel, for parts, for personnel, for skilled labor through contracting after the wet gap and into so that we can keep getting green suitors pushed forward to the FLOT.
Some of the things that commanders need to keep in mind is the engineer brigade that they may get from Corps to help the division cross the river may not be a U.S. Army engineer brigade. It may be Polish, it may be German, it may be, whatever. And the level of complexity that goes with all of a sudden, well, we're well trained in how we do this with a U.S. engineer brigade to get across this river as a division. Now I've got a German brigade, engineer brigade, very good, very capable. How do I integrate them into the plan early so that all of those complexities of terrain management, traffic control, all of those kinds of things can happen seamlessly so that we can maintain the tempo of the division's crossing.
So we're talking about interoperability, ultimately here, right? And so kind of I think about interoperability, I think about three things. I think about kind of cultural interoperability. Do we understand each other and how we do business? Just what's the software of our society, if we will, and of our Army and how we do business. There's the doctrinal interoperability, and then there's the materiel interoperability. So our couple of our allies, namely the British and the Germans, both use the same bridging system. Works well. They actually train together in Germany. Very, very interoperable. U.S. bridge systems not interoperable with theirs yet. Our great allies, the British, have just sent one of their bridge systems down to Vicksburg. We're in the early stages of engineering an adapter that's going to allow a U.S. float bridge to link up with this German or British float bridge as well. And so I think we've acknowledged that each one of us trying to do this for ourselves probably isn't going to get it done. And then something that our allies are really good at, and I'll speak for myself, and it applies to others listening to this, is they speak NATO really, really well. And it's funny when you go to work with the allies, whether the American's in charge or not, the American puts themselves in charge, and we begin to default to our doctrine, which can confuse some of the allies. But we've got these standard NATO agreements, right? So we've got 2395, wet gap crossing. That STANAG is a great STANAG. It's probably the closest thing to a checklist, for a wet gap crossing that you can find. So if you've got a Polish engineer unit facilitating a crossing by a U.S. unit, you use that STANAG. And I venture to guess that they're probably pretty well versed in it. We owe it, I guess, to be the great partners that we want them to be, to know it as well as they do. And I think that's your doctrinal interoperability that's going to allow this to happen.
And if I remember, 390.4 references it and uses quite a bit of it, and then the appendix that we put in 391 on the wet gap crossing with the Maneuver Support Center and MCTP and others here at CAC, those kinds of things are something that we always look for in doctrine. So it's not that going to be that big a leap, although I'm sure there'll be some issues and stuff, to make sure that when we do something with a NATO partner, we do speak NATO versus, I'm the ugly American and I'm going to make them do what I want them to do the way our doctrine says, as opposed to NATO doctrine.
Yeah. Well, gentlemen, as we draw this episode to a close, I need to ask, is there anything else we need to cover?
I think our ability to be able to cross rivers is not going to become any less acute. And as I said before, we have to stop giving ourselves excuses for not being good at this. Okay, we've got too many opportunities to work at this in simulation. We have opportunities to work at this in home station. We have opportunities to talk about it and work through it, at PME. And so this excuse of we haven't done it before, so we shouldn't be good at it, just isn't going to fly. And we owe it to the soldiers that we lead to be better, and to get better and to become as proficient at this as they are. Because again, those bridge crew members, those 12 Charlies that we're producing at Fort Leonard Wood, absolutely can get the job done. I mean, I've seen it. They are a great product, and they're really, really motivated. And so now it's incumbent upon the leaders to put in the same level of effort and develop that same level of proficiency to be able to do this. Bridging in 2040 is going to be different than 2023. That it's going to help us mitigate some risks to the individual soldier. I think it's going to give us some options for crossing, that we don't have now, right? Whether it's individual rafts, if it's autonomous, all those things are coming. And again, every time I talk to the men and women at the Engineering Research and Development Center, I'm glad that they're on our side, because again, they're solving problems that we don't even know we have. And then, within the regiment at large, as we deliver Army 2030 and we think about Army 2040, we're going to see more change in the Army and in the Engineer Regiment in the next 10 to 15 years than I've seen, in totality of my career. And you can either be terrified of that or you can be invigorated by that. I choose to be invigorated. One, because I go out and I talk to folks every day, and every time I talk to them, I'm convinced of the fact that our Army is going to be absolutely okay, and we're going to continue to be the best. And the changes are coming, within the Engineer Regiment. We're talking about bridging, but whether you're talking about, breaching, bridging, construction, there's some really, really exciting things on the horizon that people ought to be really excited about. But if you listen to this and you come to the conclusion, like, I'm not where I need to be on gap crossing. I don't think my division staff is where it needs to be on gap crossing. Just call us at the engineer school. Like, we will always answer the phone. We'll give you product. We'll give you LPD sessions, NCOPD sessions. We will tell you everything we think you need to know to get this right. And then the fine folks at MCTP who see this multiple times a year, I think are always available for some coaching on the side as well, and they see this. But just give us a call, and we'll get you to a place where you're comfortable. Thanks for this opportunity. I really, really appreciate it.
And the other thing is that back in the day when I was a division planner, by the time I had gotten there and we had done our warfighter with a division river crossing, I had actually gone through the planning, prepping, and the execution and simulation 5 times between CGSC, SAMs, and the train up for the warfighter and that kind of stuff. And it made, there's still things I remember from that train up that I still carry to this day. So it's starting with the majors, not what your 12 Charlies do, because they already know what they're supposed to do. It's the majors and the lieutenant colonels and the division and corps staff officers that they need their grounding and foundation before they actually get to a division. Because a company commander in command of a tank company or a mech infantry company or a team or whatever is just going to go. He's going to be told to go across, and the traffic regulation to get them across the river is not the hard part. The hard part is the timing and the sequencing and developing the decision support template specifically just for that river crossing is what majors and lieutenant colonels and colonels get paid to do. And if they don't get those iterations starting here at CGSC, when they get to division staff or corps staff, they're just going to be going like, yeah, this is going to be hard here, engineer. What do I need to do?
Yeah.
And it's too late at that point.
Well, thank you, sir. Thank you all for coming. And we appreciate you having this discussion with us on the gap crossing. This discussion will most likely continue at various echelons and commands throughout the Army. I'd like to thank our listeners for joining us today. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please hit the subscribe button on either Apple or Google Podcast to get new episodes automatically. You can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter at U.S. Army Doctrine for updates from the Combined Arms Doctrine Directorate on new episodes, as well as our Doctrine Digest and Foxhole Fundamentals video shorts, audiobooks, and most importantly, new doctrine. Finally, the views and opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect the official position of the United States Army, the U.S. Army Training and Doctrine Command, or the Combined Arms Center. I'm Major James Cole, and this has been Breaking Doctrine.